Hello, this is Kayiu, and today I'm joined by Luna Victa and Pipsqueak, and we're going to be talking about an old custom deck, Crest the Waters. So, Pip, since you're the one who made the deck, do you want to start us off?
The exact logic behind me making the deck in the first place was I was interested in the types of combo decks that exist in Custard when I first was drawn to the format. I started the format by looking at a lot of Isemerge decks. I was like, wow, this is super cool. But at the same time, Isemerge had just received two fairly sizable nerfs, and there was discussion of more to come after that point. And I didn't want to play a deck that got nerfed and just kind of invalidate all of my experience. So the decision I made was I was going to build my own combo deck, and I was going to make sure it was a janky enough combo deck I never need to worry about it getting nerfed. So I threw
Ah,
together this 5 color ramp built around this one card, Crest the Waters, because people assured me that it would not be playable. And then my first draft of the deck managed to go win I think 7 matches before getting a loss. And then I tinkered with it a little bit more, but unfortunately, for a variety of reasons, I didn't end up really committing to that much in the way of custard tournaments. So the deck didn't get the chance to shine on the big stage for like almost a full rotation after that.
Mm-hmm. And then at that point, I think while the deck was like around and was known, I think that there was I think Custard perennially has this problem of decks are made by their pilots and they're essentially only played by their pilots, and it's very rare that you will get a deck that is played by multiple people. So after Pip left, Crest didn't really have a representative for a while, and I think Scriptures of Urshad came in and more mid-rangey stuff became mid-rangey soupy stuff came into play. Like we had like a higher density of just good cards, and so I think it was around this point that you, Luna, decided to pick up Crest again and kind of made it into the. Uh, I think format scourge is probably an appropriate phrase.
format what?
Scourge.
Scourge, yeah, however you pronounce it.
It's only a format scourge if you're a moron. Um,
So it was a format scourge, you're saying?
well, given the population of custom standard, it was like a format scourge to maybe 80% of the player base.
One of the things that was
Um,
one of the things that was always true about Custard, even back in when I was playing it, is if you didn't respect the deck and the deck respected you, i.e., you weren't playing the right kind of interaction that lined up well into it, and it was making sure to run plenty of anti-aggro cards for the decks that could get under it, it felt kind of unstoppable. Like it clobbered its way through control matchups. It trounced mid range handily because mid range decks couldn't put pressure on it, just generating so much value.
Mm-hmm.
Its only hard matchups were versus aggro decks, and in particular aggro decks that could stop its board wipes. Because I think post board I was up to like somewhere in the 8 to 10 range in terms of board wipes.
Right,
Crest
and I kind of want to
was
go back to what I was saying, like to build off of that. Like format scourge, I wasn't necessarily meaning it like a negative way, but I think it really put, along with mono red, I think it put the it added a you must be this tall to the format in a way that I think hadn't really been applied before in a long term tangible sense. And I think because lots of times it was custard was just like everyone's little pet brews, and they were all kind of not janky, but they were all a little bit uh, insular in a sense. And so it was just kind of like flavor of the month, which brew is the best. And then I think Crest and Mono Red really put pressure on people to start thinking, okay, how do I beat these? I need to start having a plan rather than just being like a goldfish.
yeah. I mean, I think it was a very real pressure on the format, and it certainly had some very good matchups. Like the white black mid range deck, I think that that could only have been a remotely fair matchup if it were both the case that the white black deck were teched against Crest and Crest were not were was like teched against decks other than the white black mid range deck. Um, I don't think it was a format scourge for a couple. reasons. One, even though I worked very hard to make it viable against aggro decks, that was still a weak matchup, and there was an incredibly strong aggro deck that, in my opinion, was horribly underplayed. So if people had been competitive, there would have just been, I think, enough of that aggro deck to really beat it.
Wait,
And
which aggro deck is this? Mono red or
mono red.
Yeah.
And two, while straight down the line mid range had a very bad matchup, it was very beatable as control and sort of more skewed mid range if you were willing to think about Crest and think like, okay, how can I actually beat this?
Yeah, because like it had like a bunch of scary top end threats, but often what would happen was if you could stop Crest, the deck didn't run like to my knowledge uh like any or like much card draw outside of like perhaps Auspicial Sphinx. Um, but other than that, it was pretty low on the card draw, and so you could often like outgrind it or like um, even if like their threats ended up two for wanting you, you could still just like use the tempo advantage of just being like just answering their crest and then being having a lot of time to set up and then just start like answering any like threats they might have and then hopefully just grind them out before they can do anything.
So I think
yeah,
that was actually one of the big differences between the two generations of Crest, where
oh yeah,
the original Crest that I was piloting was just this immense greed pile that you couldn't do that against, because back then it had pre-nerf wait through. So it had access to 3 to 4 copies of on your end step, I'm going to cast this, I'm going to draw a bunch of cards, and if you counter it, you risk letting me resolve like a 7 mana haymaker.
Mm-hmm.
And against deck, it also had Jima, so it had access to this kind of insane grind where if your opponent ever went shields down to play a finisher, you could suddenly effectively reanimate 4 creatures.
Yeah, sorry, I don't have
Um,
an image of Jima, but if I remember right, Jima, it was Jima Zulev Queen, 6 black, and within spirit, and when she entered the battlefield, you can exile. Was it any number, or like was it exile?
four creature cards
Mm-hmm.
from any graveyards, and as long as they're exiled, you may cast them as though they had in spirit.
Okay, got you. Cool.
it that effect is now on a card called Shaman of the First Pact.
Not quite. They're actually split up. So one of them grants in spirit, and one of them can
Yeah,
have some
New
graveyard.
Jima grants in spirit, and Shaman of the First Pact has the Reanimator quote
Oh,
text.
okay. I
Yeah.
missed
Yeah, I
that
would.
part.
So
So
sorry for the viewers. I was having difficulty tracking down the original Jima image.
and I also the interaction that existed at that time was very bad against the spell Crest the Waters itself. So it was not usually that difficult to find a window to resolve it, especially if you were patient.
Mm.
Um, and you could eventually like double spell like some scary 4 or 5 drop and then Crest the Waters immediately afterwards. And once you'd resolve that, their counter magic didn't work anymore. And that usually was enough to just quickly put the control decks in a box, unless they had access to a fast clock. And just at that point in time, the control decks that people played didn't do that.
Mm.
Yeah, so this is a very interesting difference between the two decks. A few things happened. One, I built a much lower to the ground, much less, I guess you could say, combo-y, much more respectful of aggro version of Crest, or at least respectful of aggro in a different way.
Mhm.
And that made it significantly more vulnerable to control. So if a control deck had hard counter spells and actual card advantage, and the pilot could understood the matchup, they understood what they could let through and what they could not let through. They actually had a pretty damn good matchup. Zerapath beat me in a 3 because he was in the losers bracket and I was in the winners bracket. Salty comment deleted. he beat me in a best 2 out of 3, and then again in a best 3 out of 5 when he had lost resoundingly the first time we played in the tournament because he had a better understanding of what to counter and what not to counter.
And like if I remember right, he was on Band Tempo with Tigal, Wander, that crew.
It was much more of a hard control deck. Like it had threats, but like the key card was dissipate.
Got you.
It just had hard counter magic.
It's just that the win cons also happened to be cheap creatures.
The fact that it could
Yeah.
deploy the win cons quickly, I imagine, did help that matchup in a pretty meaningful way, though.
Yeah, and
It
was this
helped,
did this
but-
have pre-nerf bounty of the gardens?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
And yeah, so bounty of the gardens was blue and a green instant, create an XX plant token where X is the number of differently named lands you control, and then you had access to Tigal, who is 2 UU. When he enters the battlefield, you cast. I think it's target. I don't know if it's instant sorcery, but target instant sorcery. I think with converted mana cost 2 from your graveyard, you just flashback it. So it was really good with bounty, with like your cheap counter magic, with your removal spells. So, yeah.
Yeah, it certainly helped, and it did mean that I couldn't sideboard as fully into anti-control as I wanted to. But I in several of the games he won, it really did come down to him just being able to play a better control deck, because ramp decks, or at least most ramp decks, have to devote a lot of slots to cards that don't actually attack very well, if at all, which means that I'm effectively starting the game with fewer cards than my opponent, and the deck makes up for it by the fact that every threat, when resolved, is at least a 2-for-1 and frequently more than a 2-for-1. But if you can stop the 2-for-1s, then you have you're already up on cards.
Mm-hmm. And like also having to run ramp as well. Like they most of the time control is just like, okay, I'll let your ramp through, and then I have I can just build up interaction for your actual worrisome threats.
Right. I think another notable difference that Luna innovated on was treating Crest as an explosive vegetation, effectively. Where Luna's threats weren't actually 7 or 8 drops. A lot of them were 6 drops.
Yeah, notably, Titanic Crusher and Sahai Firebeast, I think, were were reasonably reachable just through Cultivate, and then if you can crest them out, then so much the better. But if not, you're not out of the game.
I didn't run Cultivate, but I did build most iterations of the deck on the philosophy of I don't need Crest, I just like to see it. But sorry,
and no worries. And my approach to it is much more of Crest is my sneak attack, where if I turn 3 Crest after I turn 2 Farseek, and they don't have a counter immediately, then I will probably put the game in a near winning position on turn 4. So the deck was really built to maximize the just wild sucker punch of turn 4, here's my World Elemental. Do you have an answer? No? Okay. That's the game.
And I want to be clear, my version of Crest was still high rolly. It's an inherently high rolly deck. I made it significantly less high rolly, but it was still high rolly, and I could see why people would be frustrated by that element of it. Although I think it could have been a healthy part of some competitive metagames.
Oh no, I think it was absolutely, again, I think providing that you must be this tall was absolutely I think it was really good for the format because it forced people to start considering okay, outside of a vacuum, how does my deck perform? What kind of is the interaction I'm running just kind of did I just put it in as an afterthought, or now am I seriously actually considering it for the Crest decks? But I think another or the main effect of Crest, I think, is really forcing people to think seriously about their interaction suites, and and I think one reason I think that Luna's more grindy version of Crest was I think was a good evolution is that
I
like
would say more aggro-y, not more grindy. I think it was, if anything, less grindy.
Yeah, it
mhm,
had less 4-for-1s and more 2-for-1s that immediately put pressure on your opponent.
Uh huh.
yeah. But I think in general, just like or like I guess the what I was trying to get at is that it's less reliant on Crest. Is that
Hmm.
the interaction suite with Scriptures of Urshad ended up getting better, and I think that like it added like some tools which made it easier to like main deck against Crest, the card specifically. But then like if you just made it so that you didn't need Crest to function, suddenly a deck that was like, oh, okay, I have a few answers to Crest, and as long as I draw one of them, I'll be fine. That was no longer a viable plan, and people had to start building differently. I think we only saw a little bit of that towards the end of Crest's life, but yeah.
Yeah, I think that many decks that were in the format at the time I was playing should not have devoted any sideboard slots to Crest the card.
Mm-hmm.
Um, they should have been, if they wanted to beat Crest the deck, been devoting sideboard slots either to like answers to my first threat or even more pressure.
Mm-hmm. I think I don't have this card on the viewer right now, but I think um, just while I remember, I think Banish was actually a piece of interaction that, despite not being instant speed, I think it like from my experience of it did pretty well against Crest because like um, it's not like it ran like super few threats, but like it definitely did have because of like being like a rampy deck, you have to like devote slots to ramp, you devote slots to Crest, and then suddenly you have like fewer slots for your actual threat. So if you could like banish like a world elemental or something, and they and then you could like one for one answer their like let's say next one or two threats, they start like desperately top decking is how I felt that in that matchup.
I do think Banish had the potential to be very good. I'm not totally sold on it because against my list, the only threat I really love it against is World Elemental. There just aren't enough fours. I guess hitting a Sahai Fire Beast is fine. I would certainly keep it in, but I would be putting greater stock on Wander the Unknown.
Yeah, Wander is definitely, yeah, just a really strong spell. And again, I sorry I don't have either of these on the viewer, but Banish is 2 black for a sorcery, which essentially exiles a creature and then also takes all copies of it from hand, graveyard, and library. And then Wander the Unknown is 1 white instant to exile a creature. It's basically Path, but
Path plus 1 mana.
yeah, Path plus 1 mana. And both of
The
those were premier removal spells in their time in their own right.
World Elemental also ate a nerf between my time playing the deck and your time, correct?
I
It
think
lost the ability to steal lands.
that
That's a
was
weird
after Soul
nerf.
played it.
Oh, that was after Luna played it. Okay,
Oh, sorry,
Sort
Luna.
of.
Yeah, sorry.
the other
So,
thing that is kind of weird, and one of the rocky parts of Crest relation, which I didn't super want to get into, but I think it is actually really relevant. The the story they started out by saying about how I want to play a unnerfable combo deck. Um, that was less true than I wanted it to be. And within literally within a couple weeks of building and playing Crest, Crest got two pretty heavy nerfs. Uh, both both of which weren't aimed at the deck, but unintentionally screwed the deck up. Um, the first of which was the Garruk Wildspeaker ban really hurt Crest because Crest was a deck that super abused Garruk.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I obviously didn't get much of a chance to prove this, but I would wager that Crest was the best Garruk deck in that format, just because of how reliably it could power out Garruk and how scary Garruk made all of its other threats. And the other thing was, in one of the many reworks to Rakoa, Crest actually lost a sideboard piece that was instrumental in my anti-control plan initially and required a rebuilding of the deck to have a better strategy against, which was can't remember exactly the card's name, but it was something Coral, and it was a 3 mana Howling Mine with Voyage. And once you discovered Paradise, instead it became uh, one-sided, and whenever your opponent drew a card, you drew a card.
It was I think it was intended to be limited fodder, and I think yeah, one problem with Crest is just like how reliant it was on Rakoa not changing. And I know like another change that also like I think this was less of a nerf and more, or like depending on the season, it was less of a nerf and more of like, well, change. You have to change how you think about the deck. But like the changes to Voyage and Paradise,
Oh
like
yeah, how many times Voyage changed and just how that completely altered the curve of the deck every time was not a great
Yeah,
moment.
uh, neither of the Rakoa changes when I was playing really destroyed the deck. The Voyage change, it's annoying. Fuck. I don't think there's any way to say this without criticizing Zoo. Um,
who's the creator of Rakoa, the set from which Crest the
yes,
Waters comes
Zoo
from.
Zoo designed Rakoa. Zoo is a perfectionist, um, and changes sets that other people see as completed a lot. And
Rakoa is still undergoing almost monthly changes, and this is 2 years after I think it was initially like two
mhm.
two or 2.5 years after it was initially released. It's I think it's at the end of in about 3 months it's going to rotate out of custom standard, and it's still seeing mass reworks of its mechanics, of its limited environment, and also like severe constructed changes.
Yeah, so the slight nerf to Voyage that happened while I was playing the deck was, in my opinion, a good thing for Rakoa in a vacuum. Like, I think Voyage became a much better mechanic with that change, but it was disruptive to the. It wasn't super disruptive to the form. What was disruptive to the format was how much that mechanic changed, and how when I was playing against people, like I would do something with Voyage, and they would say, like, "Wait, does it work that way? I thought it worked this other way," because it had worked that other way at some point in the past, and uh, yeah, that I don't have more to say about that without,
Without getting off topic, yeah, fair.
yeah,
Um, Okay. Is there anything else you guys want to talk about in general, or anything to build off of the previous conversation? Or
yeah. So about the unnerfable thing, um, you can cut this if you don't want uh, too much salt in the video, but when I was playing Crest, people started shooting for it. Like, not as in like building decks to try to beat it. That's against the custard rules. You have to sign a contract when you enter the server not to tune against things. Um, they started saying that it was too good, that it was unbeatable, except by like one specific deck. It just all sorts of, in my opinion, defamatory bullshit stemming from like a misunderstanding of the deck and a poor philosophy of approaching a format. Uh, and this was really frustrating for me because Crest was my favorite deck in that format. It is the most fun I have had playing custom standard. It is the strongest Magic I played playing custom standard. It just, my
Huge
playing
mood.
that deck coincided with a time period in which I was playing custom standard frequently, was very practiced and able to think through my decisions and think about things on a higher level than I was at any other point playing Magic. And it was enormously frustrating that people who didn't understand anything about the deck, I would tell them, like, here's how I think you should try to beat it. And they just said, you're stupid. Or, well, they didn't say that, but they must have either thought I was trying to deceive them or that I was stupid because they didn't try it. Uh,
The
I
the
and the
think
card
related
should be banned or
yeah,
like indicated that.
related to that, one of the things that actually really frustrated me is as I had started to grow distant during my run with Crest, um, one of the decks that popped up in the format and was just the scourge of the format, I would say, was one of the blue green X in Spirit Piles. That was just this hyperlinear combo ramp deck that basically had an ability to grind through any interaction. Um, Unlike Crest, which was able to grind through a lot of interaction, that deck straight up you could not beat via counterspells. And that deck got a lot of heat. Got several cards nerfed. I think got a card banned at that point in time.
No,
But
that the ban
no,
was
the
later.
ban was later. Okay, but got a lot of heat. Got a lot of people talking about bans. And one of the things that I pointed out and commented on was I was pretty sure that deck had like a 30-70 matchup versus Crest. And the pilot at the time, CFT Sock, I think largely agreed with me. Um, but since I had already kind of ducked out, we didn't get the chance to test it much. And I really have
That was
found
also
that
like
because,
at the end of the tournament, like, and that was right before rotation. So even I think
yeah,
if you had been active, and I think at that point like the crest changes went into effect. Like I think it was maybe like a week afterwards that like the nerf to conjuring went through, stuff like that.
yeah,
And
but
Contra Volt Magic.
I had really expected that even once those changes hit, because, people continued to play some iteration of that deck, and Crest in some iteration was still playable. I had expected that someone would at least test this theory of, oh, well, the person that played the deck or played Crest a bunch said that Crest is probably very good versus this deck, and the person that won the tournament with the deck said Crest is probably very good against this deck. And I feel like in a lot of competitive formats, that would be all it would take to get at least one or two people to say, well, let's try this Crest deck. Especially if this is the deck that does dummy D shit, and isn't that why most people play Magic these days? Um, so that was definitely my earlier and like slightly less acutely frustrating than your experience, Luna. But like, I definitely have similar types of salt towards people's perception of the role that Crest played in the format.
Yeah, and
Yeah,
like so I think it can be kind of summarized as like people, yeah, like so and like I can like coming back around to my use of the term scourge, I can see how it would be like I guess like reignite those memories when that wasn't my intention. So I think like Crest, I think like the whole TLDR, and correct me if I'm wrong, is that like Crest was kind of like it was unfairly pointed out to for like it was thought to be unfairly strong at some points. It was also underplayed and understood by the rest of the player base, um, and the role that it played in the format of being kind of like a gatekeeper slash uh, interaction requiring deck
regulator.
uh, was something that people were not amicable to, and that ended up and they didn't understand how like I think not only that that was necessary, but that was also a good thing for the format, and that kind of
Yeah.
soured the perception of it.
The even shorter version is Creston makes me feel good. Fuck the scrubs.
Yeah,
Okay.
I assume that can be the subtitle of this video.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I yeah, no, I think in general there's something to be said about there's a fundamental truth to the type of deck that Crest was. And it's actually interesting because I think in the past year or so we've seen a lot of Crest-like decks show up in Canon Standard and kind of ruin that format because there wasn't sufficient counterplay to them, or because the thing they were doing was actually that broken. Like, one of the things that I thought when I saw Agent of Treachery running around City, I was like, man, World Elemental makes that guy look like a bitch. Um, and that's the thing is there Crest does something you don't get to see in many standards, even though it's slowly becoming the norm now, cheating on mana to that degree. And I think that means that the way that it demands you play around it and build around it, and if you like the deck, learn how to play it, is just so different from what attracts people to most standards, that I think that kind of influenced a lot of these things.
I remember like there was definitely like a mantra around that time, which was like discussed around Isemerge, is that like standard shouldn't have combo decks. Was I think something that
Ah,
Yes, that's yes.
mm-hmm. Yeah. Anyways, I think all of this was like necessary to talk about to discuss like the environment around Crest, but I don't want to get too much off into the weeds about it. So unless there's something like new or significant, I would definitely like to like move on and talk about other
Hmm.
stuff regarding the deck.
I will say real quick. I think Crest was a little more fragile at some stages of the game than like standard Spant ramp.
Oh, absolutely. I think Pip also mentioned that too. That
Yeah.
like that like there like for in Crest's case, I think that like in standard it ended up like they had the data to point to and be like this is not okay. I think we in custom formats one of the disadvantages of having a small player base is that we rarely, if ever, have the data. But I think that like a cursory look over the interaction suites available at the time would point to, unless there's something that in looking at that interaction, unless there's something that we were missing in building Crest itself that could have made it much more resistant to the interaction available, which is a possibility, but I think a slim one. Then yeah, I think that Crest was like eminently not just techable against, but like you could definitely like just play good interaction and get away with it versus it.
Yeah, depending on like the era and everything, of course.
Mm-hmm. Um, so I did have some questions lined up, but I think we kind of like not really got through them, but we discussed some of the things surrounding them. So the first one was going to be like talking through um, the threat suite in both generations of the deck and how and why they changed. But I think we we've kind of already gone over that on like a macro level. So if you guys don't want to get into that again, completely understand. But if you do, we can definitely talk about the individual threats of the deck because I think they're also cool in their own respects and weren't always cards I got to see play elsewhere.
I kind of want to talk about the dragon. What was it called?
Caldera Tyrant or Sahai
Yes.
Firebeast? Okay, Caldera Tyrant. That one was my boy. So I'll give my little rant about that first. I think the thing that I love most about Caldera Tyrant is how uniquely powerfully it synergized with Crest as a card, because it really took advantage of everything. It took advantage of the fact you were cheating it out, because it was expensive. It took advantage of the fact it had an attack trigger, and thus the haste that Crest gave made it obscenely powerful. And it also took advantage of the fact that Crest meant that if you top decked it later, you didn't need to tap any mana. And what the dragon did, I assume there's a graphic, but it exiled the top 5 cards of your library on attack, and it got fire breathing for each mountain exiled this way, or for each land exiled this way, and then it you got to cast the rest of the cards. So this thing was drawing you 2 to 3 cards per swing. Um, and if you had been ramping a bunch, you suddenly got to say, "Oh, okay, cool. I'm gonna also cast this other threat off of here." So it was really an answer or die threat, and it also hit people like a truck.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but it also was one of the many threats in that deck with 0 ETB value. So I assume that's one of the reasons it kind of fell off.
It was awesome and cool and extremely impactful, and I did not have one copy of my 75 for most of the time I played Crest.
Yeah,
um, I preferred Auspicial Sphinx for a few reasons, and I think this really speaks to the difference between
absolutely.
our lists. It's 5 mana, so I can cast it on time, even to block against aggro if I really have to, without beating the card Crest. It has an ETB, so it doesn't need the haste. Uh, and it still can take advantage of the haste because it draws 2 cards on the turn it comes down if it has the haste. Um, so I loaded up on Auspicial Sphinxes because they're just much more reliable, but they don't do nearly as much when you do land them.
Yeah, and
They kind of
I
took the
think,
spot of almost like a wade through in a sense, except like now suddenly like you have a potential wade through that also just plays more to the board.
well, I mean, that was the amazing thing about that deck is, so the first version had tyrants and no wade throughs, and then the second version also had wade throughs. So just that deck, once it started going, just you could not keep up with it in card advantage unless you were so greedy that you just died to 8/8s coming out of nowhere.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I think one of the other changes is, were you on Sarasa in your version, Luna?
I liked Sarasa as a sideboard card. I think I occasionally had her in the main, but usually kept her in the side.
Yeah, so after Sarasa's rework, she suddenly came onto my radar, partially because I was like, okay, well, if I don't get to play with one blue Voyage Mythic, I better get to play with a different one.
Oh, I thought
Um,
it was because she was hot.
uh, Good accusation, good accusation. And the main appeal about her was the pressure she put on your opponent and the type of pressure she put on. So Sarasa came down quickly. She gave you another way to start discovering Paradise before you played Crest, which would occasionally be insanely relevant. She filtered your draws, which is so useful in a ramp deck because you have wrong half problems. And she also gave the deck a combo finish, which is funny to say given that the deck was a kind of combo ramp deck. But Sarasa ult pulling 2 Heart of the Gods out of your sideboard was 16 trample, haste, hexproof, some other excessive keyword damage. Um,
Reach, baby.
Why did that thing have reach? Okay,
It was
anyway,
very much the current
Oh.
green philosophy of soup.
throw a couple more keywords on there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and the one downside was this meant I couldn't run a bunch of Heart of the Gods main, which
Mm-hmm.
I know the one person that tinkered with the list in between you and me, um, whose name I don't remember,
It
but
was Xeris.
yeah, thank you. Xeris, I believe, was big on this deck should just be main decking the Heart of the Gods. And also was a proponent of Zuluf rights for Crest, which I wanted to try but never gone around to before Zuluf rights was super banned.
Yeah, I think
Um,
Rule of Rights with Crest I think was talked about in Luna's time, but if I remember, like again, like Luna's philosophy was the deck doesn't rely on Crest, so why waste more
right.
slots in an already crowded deck? But I think your build, which was I think like you've mentioned, a lot more explosive, a lot more focused on just cresting and then like forcing them to have it. I think that it definitely would have benefited from from trying out the Zul of Rights. Um,
Uh, I tried Zulafrites very briefly because redistricting
Mm,
was
so the fact it had 2 modes was
totally
useful.
overpowered. Redistricting was an enchantment that was a ramp spell, basically.
yeah,
So
I've got an image of it right now. Um,
I tried Sarasa, but she just didn't fit into the curve very well on my version. I find myself really prioritizing 2 mana ramp over 3 mana ramp, and she didn't feel that good against aggro because she didn't like really gain enough life to be relevant, and I could never defend her. But she was excellent in slower matchups as like an early way to get card advantage. Oh, that's one way that the threats in Zarapat's deck were very important. That he could actually deal with Sarasa at an advantage rather than uh, having a hard time with her like some control decks would.
got you. Okay. So any other threats you want to talk about before I move on?
Anku is pretty cool.
Yeah. Okay. Anku is pretty cool. I think Anku like Anku is like the kind of like I think didn't get the spotlight as much as a cheat out target, um, just because World Elemental existed. But Anku is such a good boy. Look at him. Look at his swirling desert twistery body. Yeah,
Pretty nice against Bogles.
yeah, and just like it does the pre-nerf World Elemental thing of like, okay, well, if you don't answer me in 1 or 2 turns, you are just gonna not have resources anymore to cast anything. So,
Mm-hmm.
and I don't having indestructible unfortunately was mostly trinket text, but it could be relevant.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. But yeah, I guess like my next question would be, where like I think specifically for Pip because I think she plays MSCM more, but like, um, if you're trying to like find a similar kind of play experience as Crest in like a custom format, and I guess this also includes Myriad, um, what type of deck or like would you suggest for people who are trying to or who like are listening right now and are like Crest sounds dope? Where can I play something like that?
So,
Uh,
in some ways, if I had a deck like Crest to play in MSEM, I'd
Also,
be
I
playing
think Pip, you're a little bit quiet. Are you away from your computer or something or your mic?
Yes, sorry, I forgot that my mic is now on my headset in a strange way. Yeah, so I was gonna say if I had a Crest-like deck in MSEM, I would play one. Unfortunately, I don't feel like we really do. I think the closest thing would be, the mono green turbo ramp style decks. Myriad, there's probably some like sneak and show type of variants. Various different types of cheaty ramp is kind of where I'd look. So ramp that doesn't just go up to like 6 drops or 7 drops, but goes all the way up to like 8 or 10 drops. Um, but I think, I mean, in some ways, Crest was kind of just a perfect storm because it was a incredibly powerful card that you could turn on fairly quickly in a format that didn't pressure it intensely. So at least my style of Crest is not something I think you can get other than when you go insanely broken and go like, Legacy Tier Sneak and Show.
Gotcha.
Crest was really felt like a very one of a kind deck to me. It had some of the interesting and fun gameplay of a traditional ramp deck, but it also had like a very interesting dynamic with Crest the card itself, like with what that provided to the deck, how different decks uh, had to respond to what Crest the card provided to the deck. And five color ramp is just more fun because you get to play
The best of all
such
worlds.
a diverse array of threats. Like it was a very colorful feeling deck. It was just so cool how many different wacky threats there were to try. So just that blend of like explosiveness and like putting weird focus on different resources and variety and traditional ramp gameplay is not something I feel like I've seen anywhere else.
Hmm. And I think that also is kind of why I wanted to talk about it today, just because I feel like, yeah, like I think it kind of highlights the cool part of custom is that you get experiences that you can't have anywhere else. But just in case there was something that you guys thought was analogous, I wanted to mention that. Okay, um, I don't have any more questions. So, is there anything you guys want to say before I wrap this up? No? Okay.
I think
Well,
we're good.
hey,
Yeah.
well, thank you guys for joining me today. I think it was really a pleasure to talk to y'all, especially because and like take a trip down memory lane, because again, like I think for me, like talking about these decks again, being like, oh yeah, it did this, it had this card, it had this card, um, like like custom like outside of like MSCM and even in MSCM sometimes, just because like new sets rotate and like custom decks feel like they get like so little time in the sun, so getting to revisit them is something that I really like, and I hope that like if someone would be interested in, at some point in like throwback, or like if Pip you decided to do what you did with Dirty Work and like print a alt to like a side grade to Crest, I think that would be super cool. So we could like get those play experiences that people enjoyed and like rekindle them. But yeah,
It would be
Yeah,
cool though. It would work differently in different contexts.
for
yeah,
sure, for
it's
sure.
one of those things where, on the one hand, I like the idea of that a lot, but on the other hand, when I made Villainy as a dirty work ref, I made sure to do so with the explicit permission of Simon, who the set
Oh yeah, who
belonged to,
mm-hmm.
which that's not really an option for Crest.
Yeah, fair. Well, oh well, hopefully
But
in the future there's another format where we get to experience this. Until then, I think it was super great to like retread on it and like relive the times where it was played. But yeah, until
yeah,
next time, this is Kayiu, Pip, and Luna signing off.